Hi everyone, my name is Melody and you are listening to Melody's Musings. I was kind of laughing today because I tried to record this video, I believe it was night before last when I was recording other videos, and I got all the way through the piece and realized that the video had stopped recording like after about 2 minutes. So by the time I got to the very end and realized that, I was too tired to go back and try to re-record it. So I'm going to try again. Okay, so today I have another little piece of my story to share that is a little bit difficult. It was a lot difficult, let me tell you that. Going through it, I can look back on it now and I'm okay. But this is the story of what happened on the day that my first husband had a freak accident and broke his neck and ended up a C4, 5, and 6 quadriplegic, paralyzed from his shoulders down, and confined to a wheelchair. He was 27 when the accident occurred. He was a 200-pound, very fit athlete who won numerous awards in high school for his athletic ability. And in a split second, all of that changed when he had his accident. And like I said, he went from a very fit person, able to do just about anything, very talented, intellectually. He was a designer, he was a draftsman, and worked in engineering. To someone who couldn't lift a fork off of his plate to feed himself. So this is the story of what happened. I'm not going to prolong it anymore, but I just wanted to warn everybody that, you know, this story is a little bit emotional, so it may be hard to hear. Wanted to make sure that if anybody is, you know, triggered by that sort of thing, you might not want to watch this video. So I say proceed with caution and plenty of Kleenex if you think you're going to need them. Okay, before I read the actual story, I'm going to share a poem with you that I selected to go in front of this story on my blog. The poem is called Child of Earth. Child of Earth, your bones are made from the earth. She is your mother. And if the earth can survive and move on after destruction of earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes and volcanoes, then you can survive your broken heart. Move on from your past and the terrible things that have happened. The author of that poem is a gal named Nikita Gill. Here's my story. Hurricane Alicia was the first hurricane I had ever experienced. It forever altered the path of my life, broke my heart, and blew my future onto a completely uncharted path. Here's how it happened. The best laid plans. It was mid-August 1983 in Houston, Texas. My husband, 2-year-old daughter, and I had just moved from the home of a quadriplegic man for whom we had been providing caregiving services over the previous year and a half. He was about to get married, so we taught his new bride how to take care of him and made plans to move into a home of our own. A month before we moved, we found a suitable home and made a down payment to hold it. The home was being renovated and would not be ready for us to move in until Labor Day weekend, which was still 3 weeks away. In the interim, my husband's parents invited us to stay on the campus of a small Bible college where they served as superintendents. School was out for the summer, and only a small group of students and faculty still remained on campus. We moved into a small dorm room, put all of our possessions in storage, and settled in for what was supposed to be a short and sweet visit. During that same time period, we were also on the short list of families who were preparing to work in Saudi Arabia for a couple of years. My husband was a talented draftsman and was invited by my uncle, who managed an international engineering design team, to move to Saudi to help his team design a city on the Persian Gulf. We were in the final stages of the approval process and had begun receiving phone calls in the middle of the night, which is daytime in Saudi, reviewing the last-minute preparations. We were told that we would be living in the family compound where families of all American employees lived. We would be assigned a fully furnished, rent-free home near the work site. We were excited. Plan A was that we would move into our new home in Houston, continue our careers, raise our children, and settle down to build a successful life. Plan B was that we would move to Saudi Arabia, work for a couple of years, save lots of tax-free income, and return to the U.S. to buy a home and settle down. Life was good. Doors of opportunity were opening for us daily. We had no idea that Plan C was about to rock our world forever. Per Wikipedia, Hurricane Alicia was the first named storm and hurricane of the 1983 Atlantic hurricane season. Alicia was the season's strongest and deadliest storm. It killed a total of 21 people and caused $2.6 billion, that's 1983 dollars, in damage. We moved to the Bible campus just as Hurricane Alicia was threatening to hit land. The small but powerful Category 3 storm roared onto shore from the Gulf Coast and slowly cut a direct path straight through the city of Houston, leaving a wake of destruction across the entire city and surrounding areas. Alicia not only killed many people, but also caused catastrophic injury and permanent damage in the lives of many families, including my own. The Bible College was located on the north side of the city, but was certainly not spared the fury of the slow-moving storm. Trees and power lines were down everywhere, and roads were blocked. Everyone on the Bible campus, in total approximately 24 people, had hunkered down, sheltering in place for 3 days in the only brick portion of the building at the college, the administrative offices. There was no electricity, no way to get news updates on the storm, other than battery-operated transistor radios, and food and water supplies were dwindling. This was before cell phones and internet. I recall sitting on a bench positioned against a brick wall in the outer corridor of the administrative building with my father-in-law. We watched in awe as the fury of the wind bent and blew the tallest trees on campus until the trunks were almost parallel with the ground. It was a scary sight, and when I hoped the wind would not blow the school away by the time it was over, I had never experienced such a frightening storm in my entire life. We were captives of Mother Nature until the slow-moving storm finally blew over the area. Flash thunderstorms followed for a full day or two after the main storm passed. It had only been 4 days since our move from the townhouse of the quadriplegic we had just been taken care of to the Bible college. The events of that week happened rapid fire, leaving us no chance to recover in between. Sadly, the week culminated in a freak accident that occurred on August 18th, 1983. That was the day my 27-year-old healthy husband of nearly 5 years broke his neck and became paralyzed from the shoulders down, confined to a wheelchair for life. Here's how it happened. The sprawling front lawn of the school looked like a lake. About 4 or 5 inches of standing water covered it. All the surrounding ditches were overflowing. Flooding was widespread across the campus, which was built in a low-lying residential area. This standing water proved to be too tempting for a group of about 6 or 8 young men, mostly students, ranging in age from their late 20s to mid-30s. After being cooped up indoors in small quarters for 3 days and nights, they decided as a group that they needed to let off a little steam. So they proceeded to take some large plywood boards and use them to surf across the front lawn of the school. They all donned swim trunks and tank tops and took turns running and jumping and belly flopping on the boards, coasting until they came to a stop. They were having a blast and quickly drew a small crowd of onlookers from the school and the surrounding residential neighborhood. My husband didn't decide to join the group until after he saw how much fun they were having. Meanwhile, the group became bored with surfing across the grass. Then someone got a bright idea. Hey, why don't we go to the dorm building, climb up to the second-story landing, step in front of the safety railing, and jump over the sidewalk and into the ditch? You know, we can do the Nestea plunge, which was a term that was used back then on a commercial that was popular at the time. Or we can do belly flops into the ditch. So while my husband was changing into his swim clothes, the activities moved down to the end of the campus where the main 3-story dormitory building stood. A concrete external staircase with landings at each level wound up the face of the building. The ditch that ran in front of the dorm building looked like it had 3 to 4 feet of water in it. We later learned that it only had about 1.5 feet of standing water in it. A concrete sidewalk separated the dorm building from the ditch. The ditch ran along the edge of the front lawn at the school. Someone ran to get a camera to capture the action shots. I had been watching the antics up to this point with mixed emotions. It was entertaining, but it was also a bit nerve-wracking to see grown men acting like little boys. While waiting for the second act to begin, I decided to walk back down the long outdoor corridor that ran in front of the main administrative building to check on our daughter, who had been napping. As I walked in that direction, my husband, who had just put on his swim trunks, passed me in the hallway on his way to the opposite end of the campus to join the fun. A strange feeling came over me as we passed each other, and I instinctively looked back over my shoulder and called out to him, "Be careful!" I had a fleeting feeling that someone was going to get hurt, but quickly dismissed the thought. My husband was a well-built, muscular man who had been a star athlete in high school. Once on a high school field trip to a track meet on a college campus in Louisiana, an Olympic team spotter saw his stellar performance and tried to recruit him to train for the Olympics. He played just about every sport you can imagine in high school and won numerous awards. Even after we got married, I used to tease him all the time about his addiction to playing sports. The trunk of our car looked like a sporting goods store because he insisted on carting around all of his sports gear with him wherever he went. In all that time, he had never been injured because he was also very safety-minded and took precautions to prevent injuries every time he played sports. Knowing all of that, I had never worried about his safety when it came to any of his sporting activities. But this time, something felt off. Something was not quite right. A few minutes later, just as I was about to carry our daughter down to the dorm building to watch the festivities again, my mother-in-law came racing up to me, her face as white as a sheet, and tears flowing down her face. "Melody, you'd better let me take the baby. You need to get back down to the dorm building now. Something terrible has happened. I'm going to call an ambulance." My heart sunk to my toes as she informed me that my husband had just injured himself badly and it didn't look good. She had been just seconds away from telling the men that they needed to stop the shenanigans, which were against the campus rules anyway. As she approached the scene, yelling for them to stop, she saw my husband push off the landing, jump over the sidewalk, and attempt to do a belly flop into the ditch. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck that couldn't be stopped before a horrific crash. Later we learned that because his shoes had slick red mud on them, the moment he pushed off the edge of the landing, he lost his momentum. Instead of landing on his belly, one of his shoulders plowed into the saturated soil on the far side of the ditch, which held it in place, while his 200-pound body continued to flip at a 90-degree angle. The moment of impact was caught on camera. He was now laying face down in the water and was not moving. At first, the small crowd of onlookers thought he was playing a practical joke on them. He was known to pull pranks like that, so no one on the scene who knew him well believed that he was really hurt. But he wasn't moving at all. Seconds ticked by. Finally, he managed to turn his head sideways out of the water, just far enough to say to the other guys, "I've hurt my neck. I'm serious, guys. I can't move the rest of my body. Go get one of the longer plywood boards, turn me over in the water, and gently slip it under me." Always good in an emergency, true to form, he was the calmest person on the scene. By then, I had just arrived, panting from running, and couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like a waking nightmare. It seemed that my earlier premonition had come true. I began to panic. It didn't help matters any that a passing thunderstorm with accompanying lightning strikes started to drop rain again. My main concern was that the men get him inside before lightning could strike him. I was crying and calling to the guys, "Please hurry, get him inside the dorm building and out of the rain." All of us were in shock. Many of the guys were crying. We all knew it was a very serious situation. After what seemed like an eternity, the men finally got the board under him and carried him carefully inside the dorm building. They placed him and the board upon which he was lying on top of a picnic table inside a common area. Then the long and highly stressful wait for an ambulance to arrive began. Although his mother had called an ambulance as soon as the accident happened, the hospital staff informed her that due to the hazardous road conditions and debris, it might take them an hour or more before they could get to the school location. Under normal circumstances, the drive would have been a short 15 to 20 minutes, but not today. Fallen power lines and trees blocked almost every road between the hospital and our location. While we waited, we gathered around him in a circle and cried, held hands, prayed, and did what we could to make him as comfortable as possible. Knowing that it was not advisable to move a person after a serious injury, and they had managed to do it safely, there wasn't much more than any of us could do. I cushioned his head in my hands like a pillow, tears running down my face. I kissed his forehead and tried to comfort him as best I could, but I felt helpless. My mind was racing and my imagination was running wild. He was conscious, calm, and talking. We were all very grateful for that. He didn't seem to have any brain damage, but he could not move anything but his head, and told us he could not feel the rest of his body at all. The ambulance arrived about an hour after the accident. After asking a series of questions to ascertain what had happened, one of the first responders removed my husband's wet shoes and socks, took a sharp-edged object out of his pocket, and began to poke my husband with it, starting at his feet. "Can you feel this?" "No, sir." Then he moved the sharp object up to his calves, then his thighs, then his stomach, then his chest. The same question was asked, and each time the answer was the same. "No, sir." Finally, when the first responder poked him on the top of one of his shoulders, he replied, "Ouch, yes, I felt that." That is the moment when I completely fell apart. I began to weep uncontrollably, as if he had just been pronounced dead. I knew he had broken his neck, due to the fact that we had just been living with a man who was a quadriplegic. I knew intuitively that my husband was now paralyzed too. I could tell by the glum looks on the ambulance crew's faces that it was the worst possible outcome. The rest of that day and into the night became a blur of flashing snapshots with swirling emotions attached to each one of them in my mind. First, there was the harrowing ride to the hospital in the back of the ambulance, bouncing, bumping, swerving to miss trees and power lines and abandoned cars in the road. My husband was in extreme pain and cried out every time the ambulance pitched and bounced. I was grateful that they did not turn on the sirens, which would have caused me to go into sensory overload. It was twilight. The fact that there were no streetlights working along the roads felt eerie to me. When we arrived at the hospital, we were told they were running on auxiliary power only. That scared me, and I wondered if they would be able to help him at all. After they wheeled my husband into an area of the emergency room where I was not allowed to go, I stepped to the nearest payphone to call our disabled friend, whose home we had just moved out of, to tell him the shocking news. When I heard his familiar soft-spoken voice answer the phone, I began to cry so hard I could barely speak. After explaining what had happened, there was a long pause while he gathered his thoughts. He tried to reassure me that we wouldn't know for certain if the injury was permanent until all the medical test results were in and evaluations completed. He told me that sometimes, depending on which cervical bones and parts of the spine are damaged, some people do go on to recover from injuries like this. I knew he was trying not to upset me any more than I already was at that moment, but I was inconsolable. I hung up the phone and sobbed. I felt like I was living in an episode of the old TV show series known as The Twilight Zone. I finally collapsed in a heap in a chair in the emergency room, waiting room. A nurse kept me informed of my husband's status about every half hour. They wouldn't let me see him, which only added to my high anxiety. After a couple of hours of conducting medical tests, finally a doctor came out to speak to me. I didn't want to believe what I knew I was about to hear him say. It was as if I went into a slow motion zone in my mind. Even my hearing became distorted. I wanted to cover my ears and run screaming for the door. The doctor's facial expression was worn and tired. I knew he did not want to be the one who had to tell me the bad news. The results of the initial x-rays revealed our worst fears. My husband had broken his 4th, 5th, and 6th cervical vertebrae. Although his spinal cord was not severed, it was badly bruised and swollen, which I was told often has the same outcome: permanent paralysis. I was told he was now considered to be a C5 quadriplegic, which meant he would never walk again. He would probably be paralyzed for life and confined to a wheelchair. I suddenly felt dizzy. The waiting room began to swim around me. I was also extremely nauseated. My worst fears were coming true. To complicate matters, the small regional hospital where we were at that night did not have the medical specialists on staff or the resources to properly and fully evaluate his condition, nor did they have the equipment to stabilize him. Time is of the essence to stabilize patients in critical injuries like this one. Under normal circumstances, they would have transported him by life-flight helicopter. However, because of the ongoing hurricane conditions that night, that option was off the table due to safety concerns. So a decision was made to transport him to a major hospital located in the Houston Medical Center. That meant another harrowing 2-hour drive by ambulance, given weather, road conditions, and flooding. My stress levels went through the roof during that wild ambulance ride through the blackest night of my life. My husband continued to writhe in pain at every motion of the ambulance. I begged the ambulance crew to give him something for the pain, but they refused, saying that until he was stabilized, that would not be possible. By the time we finally arrived at the second hospital, around 1:30 or 2 a.m., I was totally exhausted and numb. It was hard to believe that the accident had happened almost 12 hours earlier that day. Time was a total blur at this point. They explained to me in advance about the medical procedure that had to be done. It involved installing what they call a halo into my husband's skull. They had to drill 4 holes in his head and insert 4 thick metal rods called pins, 1 in each hole. The rods were linked together in a circular shape with another piece of metal that wrapped around his head, thus the ghastly name of the device, halo. It seemed to me to be more like a crown of thorns. 2 additional metal bars ran parallel to the sides of his neck and were attached to a sheepskin-lined hard plastic vest that would keep him stabilized, unable to move his head for several months until the swelling in his spinal cord went down. Again, they told me they could not give him anything for the pain until the procedure was over. Now, as an empath, natural healer, and highly sensitive person, especially when it comes to dealing with the pain of others, I was horrified by that thought. While the medical staff worked on him, I was slumped on the floor, leaning against the wall, anxiously waiting for it to all be over with. I was within hearing distance of the surgery room where they were working on him, and I could hear him screaming at the top of his lungs as if he were being tortured. I covered my ears with my hands, put my head between my knees, prayed and cried. I was surrounded by a few family members who had followed the ambulance to the second hospital, but on the inside, I felt lost and alone. At that point, I wanted more than anything to be by his side and to comfort my husband, but I wasn't allowed to do so. So I begged God to send his angels and his Holy Spirit to guide the doctor's hands and comfort my husband in my stead. It was the first of hundreds of times that I would spend over the next 14 years in a hospital setting, exhausted, waiting, praying, and asking God to intervene during critical times of his recovery rehab, and ongoing medical treatments. And that is how, in the blink of an eye, all of our plans and dreams came crashing down. Suddenly, the bright future I had envisioned for my family and myself became a giant, angry, red question mark, scrawled hastily against the backdrop of dark storm clouds that threatened to destroy life as we had always known it. Our life would never be the same. Life lesson number 1. Trust God in the midst of the storm. I happen to believe that all of us are on a specific life destiny path. Often the plans we make for ourselves may not be aligned with our life's destiny path. The storms of life can appear out of nowhere and toss us around like matchsticks in a whirlwind. As much as we would like to think that we're in control of our life circumstances, at some point we are forced to admit that we most certainly are not in control of anything that happens to us in life here on this earth. I also believe that there's a benevolent, higher authority in charge of the entire universe. I call him my Heavenly Father. I have known and trusted him since I was a small child. He loves each of us as his creations with a supernatural love. Like any good father, ultimately, he knows what's best for each of us. Imagine a wise and loving father, earthly father, who is teaching his infant child to walk. He sometimes allows that child to lose its balance and fall to the floor in order to teach that child that it needs the father's guidance, direction, and support when walking across the room. In this same way, starting with my husband's injury so many years ago, I've learned to rely on my Heavenly Father for guidance, direction, and support every time I make a decision or a mistake that causes me to fall or stumble. Like that toddler, I reach out to him, arms raised, crying out for his help. And he gently picks me up, heals my wounds, and puts me back on the right path every time. If we learn to yield our lives and our futures to him completely in this way, he faithfully leads us through even the darkest storms of life and teaches us to trust him with the final outcome of any situation. In the story I just read, you heard that I had created Plan A and Plan B for myself. Both plans looked good to me at the time. But who's to say that either of those plans would have turned out the way I planned them? Would I have learned the life lessons intended for me? Would I have ended up following the path I was destined to follow? I seriously doubt it. I was a hard-headed, stubborn, wild child who grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I had a lot of pride and selfishness to overcome. Had I not been stopped in my tracks by my husband's accident, I may have never grown into the person I am today. Not that I've arrived by any means. I have learned that I am a perfectly imperfect person. But I have also learned that personal development is an ongoing process, from cradle to grave, for each of us. Some of us stubborn ones just have to learn the hard way. Don't ask me why that is, but I know it to be true for myself anyway. Just as wild horses must be broken before they can be useful, so must some of us. Perhaps if we follow the path we were meant to walk, even if it's the hardest thing we've ever done in our lives, it all comes full circle in the end. A life or heart once broken and then restored is better able to serve others as well. As Kintsugi teaches us, broken vessels, or humans in this case, once repaired, become stronger in all the places where they were once weak and shattered. I think about it like this. If I hadn't walked this difficult path and learned its related life lessons, the beauty of imperfection would not exist to help other caregivers today. It is my hope and prayer that each person who reads or hears these words will learn, as I did, to trust God in the middle of each storm of life. Couple of scriptures. The Lord has determined our path. How then can anyone understand the direction his own life is taking? That's from Proverbs. And another one. We can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. I mentioned there at the end the title of a book that I wrote in 2019 called The Beauty of Imperfection. And you can find out more about that by reading my blog. The book has not been published yet, so, it's still in the editing phase. Hopefully I'll get it fully edited by the end of this coming winter. But I wrote the book as a roadmap to healing. It's actually book 1 in a series of 3 books. And each book has a separate focus, but they're all about healing. One of them's for body, one's for mind, one's for soul. So then I decided to start a blog by the same name. And some people ask me, why do you want to have a book and a blog with the same name? But they have different purposes. I don't talk much about myself in the book or any of the experiences that I had as a caregiver. I talk more about the lessons that I learned with just little tiny nuggets of my own story in there. But the blog was designed to share my actual experiences as a caregiver and the life lessons that I learned associated with each one. So if you want to look up the blog, feel free to do so. It's for some reason, you have to type in https://2 and then my name, melodyringo.com. Now, the story that you just read was Hurricanes and Halos is the blog post that I point most people to when they first go to the blog, because until you understand what happened, it's a little difficult to get into some of the other things that are in the blog. But I share this story because I have a heart for helping, first of all, other caregivers, especially full-time family caregivers who are taking care of injured or ill family members. I remember when my husband broke his neck in 1983, it was before the internet, before cell phones, before Google or any of that. And I had some training from the rehab hospital that he spent 9 months at after his injury. But other than that, I had to learn as I went along. I mean, and I was one of the fortunate ones that actually had some training from a hospital family training program. So I can only imagine for people who don't have that kind of training and end up with a family member, injured in the way that my husband was, which is very complicated. I mean, the person cannot do anything for themselves. Just try it for yourself, like I did once, Sit still in a chair, pretend like it's a wheelchair, and don't move for 45 minutes at all, except to turn your head. It's hard and it's painful. So there are a lot of other stories on the blog that go into other aspects of full-time family caregiving and the toll that it can take on not only the person who is injured or ill, but on their family members, spouses, children, etc. I was only 24 when my husband broke his neck, and ended up a lot like, many of you probably have heard of Christopher Reeve, the actor that played Superman. Fell off a horse and broke his neck. And, we just don't realize. I mean, we say life is short, and it's too short to live it miserable. Well, even if you don't die young, but you end up injured or ill with your quality of life, way down here, when it used to be way up here, that's really tough. Especially because, in a case of a car accident or a sudden diagnosis of a deadly disease, a terminal disease, the family members are, they're presented with this thought that their life will never be the same again. And they have a choice to make as to whether or not they're going to stay with that person and help them or take a hike. And I'll never forget one day I was in the rehab hospital, because I spent every evening and every weekend there when he was in rehab. And we had a social worker who was assigned to our case. And one day this man, he must have been 6'5". I don't know. I'm 5'5", so he looked extremely tall to me. Big, burly guy. And he kind of cornered me one day when I was walking down the hall after I left my husband's hospital room to run to the cafeteria or something. And he almost, like didn't want me to move. Like he wanted me to stay right there because he had a burning question to ask me. And he said to me, "When are you going to leave him? Most of them do, you know." I was offended by that question. And I looked him straight in the eye. I mean, as close to straight in the eye as I could. He was taller than me. But I was like, I don't have any intention of leaving him. I took a vow, for better or worse. And just because I'm looking at worse doesn't make that vow any less valid in my mind. At the time, I thought that if I were to leave at that point, right after the accident, I would never know what I was capable of doing. As it turns out, I stayed too long. I took care of him for 19 years after that. Well, 14 years after his accident. We were married for 19. And, it didn't have a happy ending. I got to a point where I was so burned out that I couldn't go. I just couldn't do it anymore. I was averaging 4 hours of sleep per night. And he was a narcissistic, very difficult person to live with, even before he was injured. And after he was injured, it was even more challenging. But I stuck with it way longer than I should have, but I did stick with it. And I was at the point of almost at the point of breakdown on every level when I finally made the decision to leave the marriage. And that was tough. It gets complicated when you have somebody who can't take care of themselves. And I knew that I was going to be criticized for leaving a handicapped husband. But what people didn't realize was that, first of all, I'm human. I have my limits, okay? Second of all, due to the nature of our marriage, I was always struggling. It's the best way to describe it. And trying to do the right thing, but crying on the inside. So I wrote the book, The Beauty of Imperfection, which was the book that I was looking for back when I was a caregiver. I searched bookstores and libraries, and back then there was nothing. Imagine living way out in the country in a little farmhouse that was falling down around us with a handicapped husband and a 2-year-old daughter. That was hard. Even with a good family and good support. most of our family members didn't live in the same area where we were, so anyway, I'm not going to go into all that because we'll be here all day. I think it's been about an hour now, so I'm going to leave it here for now. I pray that none of you ever have to go through a situation where you find yourself in circumstances that are just require everything in you to get through them. You know, some people today ask me, why are you so strong? Why does nothing seem to faze you? I've been through so much hardship that there is nothing anyone can throw at me that I can't handle together with my Heavenly Father. So, stuff that upsets most people, you know, it goes back to that saying that became popular there for a while. Don't sweat the small stuff. Well, my motto has been, since my husband's accident actually, I came up with this shortly after that, and I say it to myself on a regular basis. I can handle anything as long as it's temporary. And if you think about it, everything in this life is temporary. So, my advice, if you're going through a difficult time, or even if you're not, the best way to live life is one day at a time. Stay in the moment. All we have is today and this moment. This moment. Anyway, thank you for listening. For those of you that are still here, bless your hearts. I knew this was going to be a longer one, but anyway, I hope that you'll come back and see me again at some point, and I promise it's not all going to be doom and gloom stories, okay? I just felt the need to get some of this out early on so that we can get to the fun stuff, okay? I have plenty of that too. So, anyway, y'all take care. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening. And I will see you in the next video.